Greetings everyone, this is Brother Carl Tester and welcome back to our studies on Revelation chapter 16. In this part I'm going to look specifically at the kings of the east. Revelation 16 verse 12, and the sixth angel poured out his vial upon the great river Euphrates, and the water thereof was dried up, that the way of the kings of the east might be prepared. Of course, we have dealt with the drying up of the Euphrates at length, so I will only be referring to this in passing in this part. We're going to focus on specifically the kings of the east in this part. In verse 13 it says, "And I saw three unclean spirits like frogs come out of the mouth of the dragon, and out of the mouth of the beast, and out of the mouth of the false prophet. For they are the spirits of devils working miracles, which go forth unto the kings of the earth and of the whole world, to gather them to the battle of that great day of God Almighty." What I would now like to draw your attention to here is that up until this point we have been speaking of the Roman earth of prophecy, the east and the west. In the Greek, the word for earth is gi, and that means a country, land enclosed within fixed boundaries, a tract of land, territory, a region. And in the prophecy, this has been that of the Roman Empire. However, at the point we have now reached here, there is a significant change in the scope of the prophecy. We go from the limited boundary of the gi, the Roman Empire, to the whole world. The word whole is the Greek word holos, meaning all, whole, completely. And now instead of it just being the earth or the gi, it is the world in the Greek oikumene. Robert Carangola says, up to this point in the chronology of the seals, trumpets and vials, whenever the word earth appeared, it was the Greek word gay, Strong's number 1093, meaning a region. However, we now have the word oikumene, Strong's 3625, translated world, prefaced by holos, Strong's number 3650, translated whole. The book of Revelation is now extending itself to the whole inhabited world instead of just the dominant region of the beast, namely Europe. Now, the entire planet will be affected by the judgment pronounced in this sixth vial, Armageddon. This is noteworthy indeed, as the prophecy is right on time, and we would expect that if we have a more sure word of prophecy. As we entered the beginning of the 20th century, we saw we had the end of the Turkish Ottoman Empire. There was World War I, and at the exact same point, the prophecy takes on a global perspective. The entire world is now coming into view with the part that is remaining. All the families of the earth, all the nations of the earth are going to be drawn into what is remaining. And this is quite exciting. Praise the Lord. Another point that we need to bear in mind is that the word kings used here, like in the other parts of this prophecy, is the Greek word basileus, having within its meaning the notion of a foundation of power. As with the 10 kings or 10 horns of the beast, that was not referring to 10 individual kings, but rather 10 kingdoms, 10 foundations of power. Similarly, here we are not looking for individuals to come forth as kings of the east, but rather governmental powers or kingdoms to arise. The meaning, therefore, is that following the drying up of the symbolic Euphrates, and as seen being fulfilled in the ending of the Ottoman Empire, would come forth another power, another kingdom or kingdoms, and it also says this would be from the east. So then, who are these kings of the east, or what foundation of power is designated by all of this? I'm going to admit that this has not been the easiest thing for me to unravel to my total satisfaction, but I'm going to set forth what I have found. Unfortunately, among historicists, there is no real uniformity of opinion regarding the meaning of these kings of the East. Among other explanations, you will find these. Firstly, it signifies the Jews returning to Palestine. Note that I've placed the word returning in inverted commas here. To return is to believe that these Jews were the original inhabitants of the land, and that is an assumption which is quite impossible to prove conclusively, and I am going to say more about this soon. What I've just said may shock some listeners, but please bear with me. Secondly, there is the view that these kings of the East is perhaps referring to Christians coming forward as kings and priests of our God who could now preach the gospel to the Muslims and the Jews, and this was a situation that could not occur until the bulwark of Islam, the Ottoman Empire, was taken out of the way. This is the view taken by Eliot in the Horae Apocalypticae. Moving on, there is the view that the kings of the East may be the Middle Eastern countries which formed after the collapse of the Ottoman Empire, namely Iraq, Syria, Jordan, Palestine and Saudi Arabia, and this may also be allowed to include perhaps the rise in power of other nations in the area like Iran and Egypt. Now, the most popular view is that these kings of the East designate the Eastern nations, specifically I mean the Oriental nations, literally the kings from the East, meaning in the Greek from the rising sun. And also commonly included with this is Russia, while north of the Ottoman Empire it is in fact east of the power base of the beast, which is Europe. In the Horae Apocalypticae Volume 3, Eliot says, "The reader is doubtless familiar with the predictive clause as one most generally explained of the restoration of the Jews to their own land following on the decay and fall of the Turkish Empire." So Eliot is saying that back in his time, that is in the late 1800s, the view was that the kings of the East referred to the expected restoration of the Jews to their own land following the demise of the Turkish Empire. Eliot continues, "Yet I must confess that, though a priori inclined to the same view of the prophecy, and still almost wishing it to be the true one, cannot on investigation find clear scripture warrant to support it. For, first, the Jews are nowhere represented by inspired prophecy to be so concentrated in eastern countries at the close of their dispersion as to be a people gathered, therefore, emphatically from the east." And having spoken about the Jews, Eliot then goes on a few pages later and provides an explanation of the kings of the East as perhaps being signified by the expected Christianization of a great part of the East. And I'm going to read a small excerpt of this where Eliot says, "What then so signal a removal of obstructions to the Christianization of a great part of the East as the drying up of the flood of the Turkmen host and power? What so notable a preparation of the way for princes and peoples from the East, like the Magi from the sunrising of old, to come to the Christian temple and enter and worship?" So Eliot's saying that it does not relate to the Jews, although he would perhaps prefer it to be that way, but rather the kings of the East is talking about those who would now be able to come forth and preach the gospel of Jesus Christ in the wake of the demise of the Ottoman Empire. Now, this has happened to a point. However, none of these Middle Eastern countries can be said to have been Christianized. They are as Islamic as ever, particularly more so in recent times. Furthermore, the Jewish nation itself has remained steeped in Judaism and in fact hates Christianity. So in my opinion, I have a question mark over Eliot's interpretation of this aspect of the prophecy. And another point I would like to make on this, and it is that Christianity is seated in the West. Therefore, it would have had to have moved from the West to the East, if the Christianization of the Muslim world was intended by this phrase, making way for the kings of the East. So I think that this removes this as an option, unless, of course, the phrase kings of the East is purely symbolic and is not intended in any way to have some kind of geographical reference. Kashmir proffers three possible explanations for the kings of the East in his book. Under the subheading The Kings from the Sun Rising, he says, number one, he speaks of the awakenings and victories of Japan and the still more marvelous awakening of the hundreds of millions of China. So he suggests that the Oriental peoples could be one explanation. Secondly, he mentions what Eliot has said about the way now being open to Christianize the Islamic peoples. And thirdly, he mentions the view that relates to the restoration of the Jews to Palestine, but then if you read the book, he goes on and he removes this as a possible option. So that's Cashimar's view of the kings of the East. As regards Henry Grattan Guinness, in as far as I can see, while he does mention the kings of the East in one of his books, he provides no commentary as to their identity. One thing we need to bear in mind with those who wrote about all of these things before the beginning of the 20th century, and even at the time that the Ottoman Empire was finally wound up after the end of World War I, and the thing that we need to bear in mind is that they did make mistakes. As brilliant a job as Eliot, Guinness and others did, and we are most thankful to them for their work, they did nonetheless make mistakes like you and I do as we attempt to unravel parts of the prophecy that are not yet fulfilled. In my personal view, these are the key mistakes made. Number one, the early writers, for the most part, did not appreciate who the Jews are as a body of people. They did what most people do to this very day. The Jews say that they are the Israel of the Bible, and quite simply based on this, they take them to be the literal lineal descendants of the nation of Israel of the Bible, and this is quite simply a mistake. Again, please bear with me on this point as I'm going to be saying more about this shortly. Next is with misidentifying the Jews, these early writers were unable to recognize who the actual descendants of Israel are in the world. And as I have said before in other parts of this Revelation series, if you don't know who the players are in the book, that is in the Bible, then you're going to make mistakes in interpreting the Bible story. To understand what I am saying in all of this, I have provided a lengthy series on my YouTube channel called The Two Houses of Israel, and I encourage you to view that series as it's going to provide a tremendous amount of clarity regarding this important matter, so I'm not going to repeat any of those details here. And the third aspect where a mistake was made, and this is not actually their fault, and that is that they did not live long enough to see what actually developed following the end of the Ottoman Empire. They were writing about these things whilst right in the middle of all of the action at the time of the winding up of the Ottoman Empire, and they did not live long enough to see what more fully developed as a result of this. Again, this is not their fault. They did the best they could with what they had at the time. Bible prophecy is mostly best understood through the lens of history, and of course you have to be on the other side of the event to be in this position. Nonetheless, as we saw in a previous part, Grattan Guinness did a fine job in anticipating the end of Turkish domination of Jerusalem in 1917, and I don't wish to detract from that in the least bit. Let's now look at some of the more recent writers and their thoughts concerning the identity of the kings of the East. From John S. Fox and his book A Flood of Light upon the Book of Revelation, 1953, we read, "The subsequent downfall of the Turkish Empire in World War I has now paved the way for these rulers or kings from the East to drive westward into Europe today. A number of prophetical writers, amongst whom Matthew Habershon might be mentioned, AD 1844, saw clearly that these kings of the East unquestionably depicted Russia. The latter is destined to move westward after the collapse of Turkey in World War I, thereafter communizing Europe and stripping the papal beast of its ruling power." The thought of Russia being a major player in end times events has been around since the 1800s, well before the 1917 Bolshevik Revolution, and you can still find the following small book online. It's called The Russian Chapters of Ezekiel by W. M. H. Milner, and look at some of those details if you're interested. Robert Carangola says, "It is vital from this prophecy to understand that the same year that the drying up of the Turkish Empire occurred, namely 1917, Russian communism appeared with the October Revolution. The exiled Bolshevik leaders, Lenin, Trotsky, Stalin and others, had returned from abroad and the region of Siberia. With these men came the ideology, which was to prepare and equip the kings of the East, namely Russia and China, the two great Eastern nations which have arisen in this generation." A.J. Ferris's book, The Book of Revelation 1936, refers to the kings of the East as Russia, and the writer says, "And we know from the history of the last century that one power which kept Russia from invading Europe was the Turkish Empire." From the Book of Revelation by Charles Jennings, we read this: "The significance of the great river Euphrates being dried up in preparation of the kings of the East is to make way for their westward movement. The Euphrates River is significant of the natural barriers, cultural and racial distinctions between the people of the East and those of the West. The Israel people," and he's talking about the Anglo-Saxon people, "have always been located on the western edge of progressing civilizations, while the Arab and Oriental have remained in the East." And of course, we know that globally speaking, we often speak about the East and the West. Charles Jennings continues, "Physical, racial and cultural barriers have been for several years in the process of being dried up or removed, which gives occasion for foreign influence into the Western nations. Even though this was a historical event that has already been fulfilled," and there he's referring to the drying up of the Turkish Ottoman Empire, he continues, "The principle of an Eastern influence into the Western world is currently very evident, and I doubt that anyone would disagree with that." Again, Charles Jennings continues, "All of these will result in detrimental effects on our Western culture while exposing our weaknesses to encourage a military attack from the East in order to satisfy the growing demands of the modern Islamic and Oriental nations." Now, there are many more quotes from different historicist writers that I could provide. However, the most common views that I have gleaned appear to be that it's either the Jews or perhaps the Christians, and this comes from the writers in the 1800s and early 1900s. And then with the writers that came after this, they went on and pointed to Russia, the Islamic and Oriental peoples. Now, while Russia is obviously north of the old Ottoman Empire, we need to note that it is in fact east of the seat of the papacy. That is, it is east of Europe, so that is significant in my view. Furthermore, communist Russia came into being in 1917, which was the same year that the Ottoman Empire lost control of Jerusalem and were writhing in pain on their deathbed. So the timing fits for the Russians to be one of the component parts to make up the kings of the East. As regard the Muslim nations that were able to form due to the drying up of the Ottoman Empire, they are well known as Middle Eastern nations. The timing and Eastern designation of these nations is a good fit in my view. In relation to the Oriental nations, they are obviously in the east, from the land of the rising of the sun. And while today many will readily think of China in relation to the kings of the east, let's not forget Japan. Japan was for much of its history closed off to the rest of the world. However, at about 1846, the Japanese realized that to maintain their exclusiveness, they must be able to resist the Western powers who were already intruding into China. The shogun was aware that Japan lacked the resources to bring her defences up to the necessary standard. The Mikado, and most of the nobility were in favour of actually increasing isolation, whilst at the same time there was a small but able and well-informed minority who had become convinced that isolation was a fundamental mistake and that limited contact with the West could be scientifically turned to Japan's advantage. Without going into the historical details and risking boring you to tears, Japan was westernized, and by joining with the Allies in World War I, the Japanese gained the former German Pacific Islands, and their population increased from 27 million in 1852 to 72 million in 1942. Let's remember we are in the East. We are dealing with a rising Eastern power at the same time the Ottoman Empire was coming to an end. The rise of the Japanese was obviously not a result of anything to do with the Ottoman Empire itself, but the timing of things is noteworthy in my opinion. As we all know, Japan was a major player in World War II. And by the way, it is still a major economic power in the world today. But going back to World War II, it was a major military player at the time, and it met its military end after 2 atomic bombs were dropped on it in 1945. Now, given that we are dealing with a prophecy that is clearly in the 20th century, I'll say that again, the prophecy is now clearly in the 20th century, and this has been a time of the gathering of the nations. It has been a time marked out by almost ceaseless wars. It is easy to see how that a nation like this, known to be the land of the rising sun, that is, the land in the east, we see this great Eastern power, and we can see that the identity of Japan as one of the kings of the East does make some sense. At least it makes sense to me and a few others. I do intend to say a little bit more about this when we get to the seventh file of Roth and go to World War II and beyond, so please park this thought for the time being. Today, China obviously dominates the Oriental Eastern scene, and it will be interesting, if I can put it that way, it will be interesting to see what side the Japanese and other Oriental nations come down on if in fact we go into World War III. And before I leave the East and the Orient, let's remember that the most populous Muslim nation in the world today is to be found in Southeast Asia, and it is Indonesia. This Wikipedia article, for whatever it's worth, says this: Islam is the largest religion in Indonesia, with 86.7% of the Indonesian population identifying themselves as Muslim in a 2018 survey. Indonesia is the most populous Muslim majority country with approximately 231 million adherents. So do you think there's problems going to come out of the East? I think so. So to clarify the matter, my understanding of the identity of the kings of the East is that they are to be found with Russia, the Middle Eastern and Oriental nations. And with that, I'll end this part of Revelation 16 and the kings of the East. In the next parts, we're going to look at the identity of the three unclean spirits. So I look forward to meeting with you there.